I'm impressed by CSM. I've already, this morning, I talked with a number of researchers here, and you already have a critical mass of folks that are working on energy, on Earth systems issues, and with the policy focus. And as someone who's very interested in economics as it relates to policy, that's great. As the slide here indicates, we're talking about confronting climate change, so the underlying assumption or premise here is that climate change is a problem, and it's something that we need to confront. But I guess I'll start off by saying you can adduce at least 3 arguments to say that it's not an issue that's worth confronting. At the first level, you could argue that climate isn't really changing. At this point, the evidence is overwhelming that it is changing. 14 out of the 15 warmest years on record are during this century. And in addition, 2014 now recorded as the hottest year in terms of average global surface temperature on record. It's pretty hard to continue to maintain that the Earth isn't warming. Of course, then there's a second possible line of argument to say that it's not a problem, or at least one that humans should not be addressing. And that's the argument that it's not human-caused. They're ever finer in their level of detail in the size of the grids that get smaller and smaller. And although there's huge uncertainties, no doubt, the models continue to tell us that increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is leading to global climate change. It's pretty hard to really refute what that there is a strong consensus among scientists. By one measure, where you look at published papers, among the published papers that are looking closely at climate change and addressing whether it's anthropogenically caused, 95% of them argue that there is a very strong human impact. I think there's one more authority that might convince you, and that's the Pope. It is man who continually slaps down nature. So many of us, many of you might take some comfort in the fact that you have the Pope on your side. And I would mention that it's not just a question of whether there's current warming and is currently anthropogenically caused, but it's also that further climate change under business as usual is expected. The consensus statement by the climate scientists on the IPCC said that indicates there'd be continued increases. So that's the second argument that it's not human-caused. I'm going to suggest that at least the scientists think that it is human-caused. So what the third line of argument you could make is, okay, it is human-caused, but it's not necessarily worth confronting because it might be a problem that to try to overcome it would cost more than it would benefit us. And that's an argument, I think, that you cannot immediately dismiss. It's conceivable, at least, that the human cost of confronting climate change would exceed the benefits, where the benefits are the avoided damages that would otherwise occur. So where are economists on this? I'm an economist. Largely, we defer to the scientists on issues 1 and 2, namely on the question of whether the climate is changing and on the issue of whether it has whether humans are contributing significantly to it, which of course has implications as to whether we can do something about it. But on the third issue, whether the cure is worse than the disease, here economists do have something to say. And I'm going to provide a slide here. I know that some of you have a lot of economics background, some of you have much less. I'm going to throw a couple of slides at you today, bear with me, but I hope that at least for those of you with less economics background, the basic ideas from the slide come through. Here's a slide that I know that Jared has used in his classes many a time. And for an industry, for example, like cement, you've got a private cost of supply. That's what marginal private cost is. And you've got a demand curve, and supply and demand are equated at Q0. But for something like cement, where the process of producing it generates greenhouse gases, there's an external cost. And that gives the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost. And when you've got an external cost, economists with virtually no exception, will say there's in principle a way that the government can come in and make things better. Now, the in principle is important. I'll get back to that in a second. But basically, two ways. One is to introduce policies that raise the private cost, act as if they took external cost into account by mandating certain technologies or imposing some performance standards. In either case, you cause somewhat of an increase in the cost of producing cement that accounts for the external cost. And the important thing here is that that generates a net benefit, here given by area A. And why is that? Well, if we were to be beyond Q1, the social cost for each increment of cement exceeds the benefit which is given by the demand curve. So by reducing cement output, incorporating the external cost, you get a net gain. The gain in terms of the avoided environmental damage and the avoided cost of, because you're producing less cement, as those resources can be used elsewhere, that exceeds the cost to society in the sense that there's less cement used, which has a value as well. So that's what economists say. There's a benefit here. The cure is not worse than the disease. This is very simple. It's simple and, in my view, very powerful. It's also broad sweeping in the sense that it applies to lots of contexts besides global climate change. Whenever there's a significant externality, if you can get people to take that externality into account, producers or consumers, to take it into account and modify their behavior, the benefits can exceed the costs. For example, in the context of local air pollution, the benefits from policies to clean up the air, whether it's by reducing volatile organic compound release or particulate matter or nitrogen oxides, exceed the losses of profit or the higher cost of living to consumers. In the context of urban congestion, these high occupancy vehicle lanes, they do impose costs on drivers, but to the extent that those lanes are priced right, that nuisance cost, that more than nuisance cost, that higher cost of driving is more than offset by the value of time saved by the drivers because the lanes are less congested, the roads are less congested. It also applies to fisheries. In the context of fisheries, there's an externality when each fishing operator takes fish out of the common pool. Less fish in the pool, it imposes costs on others, makes fishing more difficult for others. There are such things as individual transferable quotas and other policies that take the externality into account and actually create gains that exceed the losses. So the idea here is to deal with the externality. One way to do it is to introduce taxes, a price on a good associated with the externality. Another is through conventional regulation. More on that in a second. And we're starting to do that. So this, I don't want to be entirely pessimistic or gloomy here. This slide indicates where emissions pricing, guided by the idea that there's an externality, is actually in place in the context of climate change. Carbon taxes is one way to price according to the externality. You price fuels according to the carbon content, which is thus related to the carbon dioxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas. And you can see the various countries, and this isn't an exhaustive list, that have carbon pricing and the prices of the carbon taxes that are imposed. And similarly, cap and trade. One thing we can figure out from cap and trade is the prices of the permits or allowances. That's like the tax. And those are the prices here in the European Union, in New Zealand, and in the eastern US, and in California. So that's good news. Two comments, though. We shouldn't perhaps take too much cheer from this. Shouldn't be too cheered from this. One is it's only fragmentary. And that is, carbon is not priced, or greenhouse gases are not priced everywhere. There's a subset of the globe that's actually doing this. And secondly, even those countries in general that are pricing carbon, arguably, and there's a lot of uncertainty here, they aren't pricing it high enough. And how do I say that? Why do I say that? Well, one reason is that the US government grouped together about 12 agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the Treasury Department, various departments, to try to figure out how big is this externality. And I won't go into details, but they came up with a central value recently of about $40 per ton, which is to say that for every extra ton of emissions of greenhouse gases particularly of carbon dioxide, the damage in the form of the contribution to global climate change, now and in the future, associated with that, and it's also in the future because it stays in the atmosphere and it stays for a long time, is about $40. Now, if you believe that number, and by the way, there's a lot of uncertainty, ranges from, the confidence interval or the distribution extends close to 0 to $120, so there's a lot of uncertainty, but the central value being 40, that suggests that we're not pricing carbon enough. Just suggests, again, I want to acknowledge the uncertainties, so this is just to indicate that the $40 per ton number, if you believe it, would suggest that not only are not enough nations taking part in pricing carbon, but those that do, in general, are not pricing it high enough. And the scientists argue that what we're doing now is not sufficient. That indeed, there's a very good chance that under business as usual, the atmospheric concentrations will exceed that amount, which leads to cataclysmic climate change with the possibility of the losing of the Antarctic ice sheet, which would cause a huge, massive sea level rise, a reversal of the thermohaline current, which keeps Europe warm, with far more serious and frequent extreme storms. I think there are ways out, and hopefully the policy community can recognize them, or we as citizens can recognize them. One is the issue of unfairness. Many are concerned that if you price carbon, you cause electricity prices, natural gas prices, gasoline prices to go up. It's unfair, disproportionately affect low-income households. We can't do that. Even if this area A exists, A is the aggregate gain, net gain. Doesn't mean everyone wins. There are winners and losers. How can we undo potential unfairness? Second, some would argue that, well, okay, maybe A is the aggregate gain, but there are sectors which have a legitimate interest in maintaining their profits or maintaining employment. They don't want to be especially hard hit unless they can be reassured that it's not going to really hurt their stockholders or their workers. So what can we do to reassure that maybe there are ways of putting on these policies that helps avoid serious losses of profit or serious losses in the value of firms on the market? Third, some would argue that these policies are not going to be environmentally effective. This is nice in principle, but how do we really know that these highfalutin policies like raising prices is really going to lead to a reduction in emissions? And so that's another issue. Fourth, is it a problem that the public just doesn't fully understand the problem, isn't fully aware of it? And if they did, would they then support the policies that are needed? And fifth, what if the public is in general supportive? And I'm actually going to offer you some numbers that suggest that there is pretty wide support, well over 50% for policy changes. But what if it's that our federally elected legislators somehow defy the public? And I think there is some of that going on. And how do you overcome that? So I'm not going to claim that I've got a perfect solution to all of these, but I think we have ways of making some inroads. So let me take each of these in order. How can you make it more fair? Well, here's the problem in a way. Here's looking at a $15 per ton carbon tax. This is a study that was done about 7 or 8 years ago by Gib Metcalf, who had a position in the Obama administration, is now at Tufts University. And what he's looking at is when you order households according to their income, with the lowest 10% or decile of income, a decile on the far left, and the highest 10% of income households on the far right, and they're ordered this way. What is the added cost as a percentage of income from a $15 per ton carbon tax? By the way, that's less than the $40 per ton I was suggesting might be something to focus on. What he finds, as you see here, is that it's very regressive in the sense that it hurts the budget disproportionately more. You can say it raises the cost of living as a percentage more for a low-income household than for a high-income household. And that's reflective, among other things, of the fact that low-income households overall spend a larger fraction of their budget on heating and transportation, with some extent, and other energy-intensive goods and services. Recycle it back to the economy targeted especially to low-income households. And one way to do this, and there's only one of many, is to recycle it in the form of lower payroll taxes, which are highly regressive. That is, they're borne disproportionately by low-income households because there's a cap on it. And what Metcalf found when he looked at the combination of a carbon tax and a payroll tax cut, where the overall policy is revenue neutral, meaning that the lowest income households don't get harmed. So that's one of many options. Some of the most disadvantaged are hardest to reach because they may not be working or they may not be paying income taxes. So it's sometimes hard to reach them. I'll also say that area A we looked at earlier, that's assuming the government is sort of making good use of the money. If the government wastes the money, as many would worry, this isn't going to happen. But this is at least suggesting a way of dealing with the trade-off. And I know that I think Jared is doing some work on the revenue-neutral carbon tax that was introduced a few years ago in British Columbia. And in British Columbia, they did this. They did this kind of recycling, whereas it was a $10 per ton carbon tax, which grows over time. 23% of the revenues gets returned to low-income households. 14% goes to tax cuts for small businesses, which some would argue is a matter of fairness. And so this isn't just entirely hypothetical. In British Columbia, they're doing that, and Jared is now looking at the overall impacts of the carbon tax. I will mention, I have to be a little bit gloomy since I'm an economist, that there is some trade-offs here. It sounds great, but if you return the revenue certain ways, it's not as good as if you return it other ways. And this is from some work that I've done. If you give the revenue back as a lump sum, or that is a rebate check, it's more costly to the economy. This says it's in our example where we looked at something akin to about a $20 carbon tax. It would cost the economy about 0.5%, 0.56%. It's the damage to GDP. On the other hand, if you can use it to cut personal income tax rates or corporate income tax rates, you can reduce the cost more. But some would say, fine, if we really need to target some folks who aren't paying taxes otherwise, do it through a lump sum tax rebate, even if it's at a somewhat higher cost in terms of efficiency. Okay, so that was at least to suggest that one can address the unfairness issue. May not be perfect, but at least it may temper that issue. A second issue, which you may also think is an unfairness question, might seem unfair that the costs would be inordinately borne by a few industries, namely those that intensively supply carbon, oil and gas, or coal industries, or those industries that purchase goods and services that carbon-intensive fuel, such as petroleum refiners, or the electricity industry, or the railroad industry, or primary metals. What can you do to try to reassure those industries or to find a way that you can introduce carbon pricing without causing a loss in profit? I'm going to look at this next issue. This may reduce, or at least if not change the influence of these industries, change their stance on the issue. And I'm pretty excited about this, to be honest, and I think that some of these ideas have actually been catching on. So how can you reduce the opposition from some industrial stakeholders that, arguably really, you can understand why they have a stake. No one wants to defy the stockholders or to make the stockholders unhappy or to cause unemployment. So here I'm going to throw another graph at you. I'll try to make this clear for those who haven't had much economics. Say that the good in question is coal, and you introduce cap and trade, which is a cap on total emissions allowed by the industries that are covered. And each firm within these industries has to submit emissions permits, or emissions allowances, they're sometimes called, for every ton of emissions being generated. If you introduce cap and trade, basically what you're doing is you have a limited supply of these permits or allowances, and that guarantees, if it's enforced, that the amount of emissions will go down. Well, for coal producers, to reduce emissions, it's not much you can do in terms of changing the process of production. There's some things you can do, but it's difficult. You can switch from one kind of coal to another. There's a little bit you can do, but by and large, one of the ways that you have to do it is a restriction on the allowances that you have really restrains output. For the industry as a whole, that means output will be restrained below what it would have otherwise been, which means that with shortage of supply or less supply, there's an increase in price. If you do it through a cap-and-trade system where the allowances are given out, the restricted supply, to firms without charge, just give them out, the government has to decide how to allocate them, that higher price means that this coal industry is going to get more return relative to the cost of providing coal, and that area R is kind of a windfall. It means that they're, in effect, getting monopoly-type profits. That's putting it a little strongly, but they're getting these so-called rents because what the government has done by restricting the supply of permits, it's forcing the industry to cut back on output, which is raising prices and creating these rents or extra profits. Now you wonder, why won't firms cut back anyway if it's going to raise profits? Well, they'd have to collude to do that, which is illegal. But when the government comes in and restricts the supply of permits, they have no choice. And what this means is this, in this diagram, the area R, that rent, exceeds what otherwise would be the loss of profit given by that magenta-colored trapezoid. So they actually come out ahead. Now, this may seem, you may not believe it, but let me try to substantiate it in a moment. On the other hand, if you were to auction out all the allowances, then what would otherwise be this extra profit gets bid away and competed away. And the auctions are sold to the government, so it's the general tax-paying public that gets the revenue. So there's a whale of a difference between the two, but the main thing here is that by giving the allowances out free, you don't necessarily cause a profit. Indeed, in this case, profits would be higher than under no cap and trade at all. Now, this may sound far-fetched. One way I'll try to substantiate it is to show you some results from a computer model. I don't know, for some of you that may actually make it worse, but I will do that. This is a model that I developed over the years with Mark Halfstead, who's at Resources for the Future. Jared mentioned that. He was a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford earlier. And what we looked at was a cap-and-trade system in the U.S., similar to what was proposed in Congress in 2009 under the Waxman-Markey bill, one that would lead by 2020 to a 17% reduction in emissions, and it implied a carbon tax, or sorry, an allowance price of about $25 per ton on average. This is the impact over about a 15-year period from 2010 from 2005 to 2020. And what we see is we're comparing the case of 100% auctioning of the allowances with the case where you give them all out free and an intermediate case, which I'll mention in a second. What this indicates is that if you auction the allowances, yeah, it's going to really cause a loss of profit. And for example, for the coal mining industry, it causes a loss of profit on average of about close to 30%. Similarly for the generators that use coal to generate electricity, and somewhat less for industries that aren't quite as carbon intensive. So that, like in this diagram here, suggests if they don't get this area R, they're going to lose significant profit, and you can certainly understand the opposition. On the other hand, if you give all the allowances out free, it claims that profits would go up by, over 170% because they're getting these significant windfalls from the value of the allowances, which is associated with the fact that prices go up. Now, I'm not going to stake my life on the accuracy to the last decimal point of these numbers, but I do think that they qualitatively do suggest what's going on. And what it suggests is this area R is very important relative to the magenta trapezoid. Then we did another experiment. We said, what if we just give out enough allowances to prevent profits from falling, rather than giving them all out free? And in this diagram, it suggests that if you give, let's say, about a quarter of the allowances out free, then the area R will be about 1/4 as big, and it might just compensate for what otherwise would be a loss of profit. And here's what we found. We, by design, just gave out enough allowances to keep profits from falling. It turned out 3.2% of the allowances had to be given out to coal miners, 3.2% also to coal generators, smaller percentages as you go down the line. And there's a lot of revenues at stake. But I will say that there's been some empirical work related to the European Union's cap-and-trade system called the emissions trading system. And what they found after the fact, when they gave all the allowances out free, which is what they did at the beginning, the electricity producers, as a result of the program, they're moving toward a substantial share of the allowances being auctioned because they realize they don't need to give out all the allowances free to restore profits. In California, I was on a committee that helped advise the state as to how to design its cap and trade system. One thing that we suggested was heavy reliance on auctioning. We didn't need a lot of free allocation to restore profits. Initially, about 85% of the allowances are given out free, but by 2020, that will be reduced to 40%. The rest will bring in revenues, and the revenues are quite substantial. By 2020, about $1.4 billion in revenue should be collected from the auction, it's estimated, which is 1% of California's state budget. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of squabbling over how to use that. Governor Brown wants to use it to offset other taxes, but then there's also some rules that say that some of the revenue should be used to finance green projects, and other parts of the revenue should be used to help set the cost to disadvantaged groups. So there's a lot of squabbling on that. Now, one might be uneasy with this idea of giving free allowances to the firms that are producing fossil fuels and that are contributing to the emissions and the increasing concentrations. Shouldn't polluters have to pay for all the emissions? I would say to a large extent, it's not just the polluters that are the firms that are responsible for the pollution. It's also us consumers who purchase the goods and services. And so I think we're all in this. And that in a sense, what we're trying to do here is to get something through. And I don't think there's any, my own view is it's not ethically irresponsible to prevent a profit loss. Now, it has to be acknowledged that the more you give out free allowances, the less comes to the government, the less can be used to cut taxes. So it's shifting the burden onto the general tax-paying public. But I think that's okay, and my own view is, look, if this is what's necessary to overcome political opposition, I think it's worth doing. A certain amount of pragmatism, I think, is worthwhile. Half a loaf is better than none at all. So that's a second point, which is, I also want to mention, the more you give out free, the bigger the cost to the economy because there's less opportunity to cut other taxes. Less money coming in. So, one other thing I want to mention in this context. The same idea can be used to help win political support for a carbon tax, which is an alternative way of pricing emissions. And without going into the details, if you have a carbon tax, and actually this has not been, I think, generally recognized, if you basically let each facility give them a certain amount of emissions which are exempt from the tax, and only tax them on their emissions that exceed that level, then just like under free allocation under cap and trade, there's rents that are created. And so you can have a carbon tax as well that doesn't hurt profits by, in this sense, the free allocation of the tax obligation. You give a certain amount of, you allow a certain amount of emissions free. That, I think, hasn't been fully recognized. Okay. Third issue is environmental ineffectiveness. Will local policies, when I say local, if it's a policy that's introduced by one nation, say the nation of New Zealand, will it be ineffective? Thinking in my own state of California, that's been an argument that's been leveled much against California climate policy because the claim is when California acts and the rest of the country, much of the rest of the country doesn't, it's all cost to the state, little benefit. Why? Because, greenhouse gases distribute themselves relatively uniformly throughout the globe. The extent that the concentrations are reduced globally, it's going to be very little, and if there's any climate benefit, it's going to be diffused over the whole globe. California is only going to enjoy some very small fraction of the benefit. Why do it? I think there is a counter-argument to this, but it's a gamble. The counter-argument is that by taking action, California will be catalyzing action by other states if it can as the first mover, show that it won't kill the economy, that it can be done, to reassure other states, and then other states, indeed other nations, will act sooner than they would otherwise, to the benefit of California as well as the rest of the world. But that's a gamble. It's a strategic gamble. But I think that's what California proponents of cap and trade of its climate policy more generally, are banking on. I trust that's the same thing in other states. Probably something that in many other states that are pushing forward, including Colorado, have in mind. So that's one counter argument. There's a second problem, though, associated with what I'm calling local policies. And so the first problem was that only a small fraction of the benefit, at least without the strategic effect, is enjoyed domestically. The second problem is called emissions leakage. And let me try to articulate that problem. I'll use California as the example. If California introduces more vigorous environmental climate policy than most other states, it's going to raise the cost of generation in California substantially. This state, California, imports half of its electricity from other states. And if policy doesn't account for that, what will a utility do that's buying the wholesale electricity and then distributing it to consumers? It's going to purchase less California-generated electricity and substitute imports in order to escape the regulations, because it has to issue permits for all the electricity generated in the states. If the electricity generated outside the states, if we don't account for those emissions, then it's going to get off free. And this will be leakage in the sense that, sure, as the utilities switch to imported electricity, California generation goes down. There's less emissions generated in the state. But there's offsetting increases in emissions because California now demands more electricity from out of state. The nation or the globe as a whole, there's been no change. What can you do about it? Well, I think the Air Resources Board has been very thoughtful in trying to deal with a fundamentally difficult problem. It tries to figure out, well, what are the emissions associated with imported electricity? So if you import more electricity, you can't escape being charged for those emissions. But it's very hard because there's a big grid out there. And whether it's a coal-fired generator located in Utah or a hydro generator located somewhere else, that all goes into one big grid. The electrons, it's like they're all in one big bathtub, to mix metaphors. And it's really hard to know when California increases its demand for imports, whether it came from a dirty generator, so to speak, or a clean one. What California's done is it's recognized in many cases it can't identify where it comes from. So it's basically, what it's done is it applies an emissions rate, which is the average emissions rate out-of-state utilities. In some cases, that rate that it applies will be too high because the marginal source of emissions will be a clean generator. In other cases, too low. You hope it averages out, but it's imperfect, but it's a way of dealing with leakage. Now, what would solve a lot of these problems is if we had global participation, or at least national participation. That would eliminate a lot of these problems, both of these two problems I just mentioned. The Western Climate Initiative was a collection of 4 Canadian provinces, started by 4 Canadian provinces and 7 US states, who showed interest in having one very large cap-and-trade system, which would help obviously deal with the leakage problem. These in green are the states and provinces that indicated they were hoping to participate starting some, 6 or 7 years ago. And actually, the number of states that have actually signed on, it's just California and Quebec. Leakage remains a very serious problem. It may be, some speculate, I'm not sure how realistic it is, that President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which was proposed in last June, that's going to encourage more states to take part in this kind of effort, but it's not clear that that will happen. So it's a problem. And again, the problem ultimately would go away more if there's a global policy. So I want to turn now to how can we encourage more global participation? Well, let me first say what approach has been taken to try to bring in developing countries. And I myself am quite critical of it. It's an approach that's embedded in what's called clean development mechanism. And it's an offset program. And what it says is, if an entity in the US, say a petroleum refiner that's under cap and trade, if it finances a project in a developing country, and that project is deemed to have reduced emissions in that country, then it can get credit for those emissions reductions just as if it had, on its own soil, that is, this entity in the US, had cut back. So it's a way of giving another option. The real problem comes in knowing whether those projects that get deemed as having reduced emissions in the other countries are so-called additional, whether they were undertaken only because of this program or whether they would have been undertaken anyway. Because if they would have been undertaken anyway, then it's nice that they're getting this extra subsidy for the project, but it's not reducing emissions relative to business as usual. And many researchers, including my colleague at Stanford, Michael Wara, who's a law professor there, he argues that about over 50% of the projects deemed to have been additional in China, many of them are hydroelectric projects, are not. They would have been undertaken anyway. So that's a real problem, and maybe it's something we should stomach, but I want to suggest two alternatives to increasing developing country participation, broadening the base. One is, and this will be my last graph, I promise you, it is by generous allocation of emissions allowances to other countries. And what this graph says, and the idea here is, here's emissions allowances, levels in China, E0, under no policy change. Say you allocate to China this many allowances free. Well, under these circumstances, if the initial international allowance price is given by this line, then China will decide it's in its interest to cut back emissions all the way to E star. This will be the cost of doing that. This is the marginal abatement cost. But what will it get in return? It will get in return the value that it gets from selling all those allowances beyond what it was allocated. This rectangle is what it gets back, and the net gain to China is the green area minus the red area, and the way it is here is they got enough allowances that the green area exceeds the red. So actually, what happens is you're giving them enough allowances so they can sell enough that it's still in their interest to cut back, but the revenue from the sales is enough to compensate for their costs of abatement. And Jeffrey Frankel, and among others, he's a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, has suggested this. So far, it's getting some attention, but I think it deserves more. And I think there's another way you can try to broaden the participation. And that is by focusing on local pollution benefits that are intimately connected to reductions in greenhouse gases or reductions in energy use. And he used to be at Resources for the Future. He's now at the International Monetary Fund. Ian Perry has done work on this. And what he's looking at is, forget about the climate-related benefits for an individual country. Suppose they introduce climate policy taking into account the local pollution benefits, the avoided health costs locally from various other pollutants that go along with greenhouse gases, such as sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide. These go along with reduced, because these are all related to cutting back on electricity consumption and on production of fuel. And in China in particular, this is very important because China relies heavily on coal. And what this shows is, for a variety of countries, what the net benefit is, and in every case, really, it's positive. So China is taking much more vigorous action on climate change. And back in Beijing a while back, there was a joint US-China accord where China indicated it's going to establish a peak for its emission. Partly, I think it's out of concern for the various local costs of pollution associated with energy use. So when you basically make carbon more expensive, you're also reducing other emissions that go along with the process of production. And I think the extent that we look at these co-benefits, the more these policies will be attractive and the more we can get a broader base. So the main point here is that there are a lot of problems that occur because we're dealing with a global problem locally. And getting broader participation can be especially useful. And I think there are at least two ways of doing that. One is more generous allocation of allowances under cap and trade, or some generous allocation of exemptions under a carbon tax. And the other is by paying more attention to the co-benefits. All right. So I want to look at two more issues, but I want to take a slight side trip here and mention two related points before I get to the last two. The first is that I'm not just arguing for pricing greenhouse gases as the only solution. There's more than one market failure out there, and one important market failure is related to innovation. And this you'll find in any economics textbook, that when an inventor engages in research and tries to invent something, and does invent something, he or she only is able to capture a subset of the fruits of that invention, because the knowledge that is gained in general spills over to others. So the overall social benefit exceeds the private benefit. There's a kind of positive externality that the inventor is generating to others, which is great, but the problem is that it means that the incentives for inventive activity are insufficient. And what economics textbooks say, when you've got an insufficient incentive, there's a positive externality, you want to reward people more. And one way to do that is through direct technology promoting policies, such as liberalized patent rules or subsidies to research and development. So my own view is that combining emissions pricing, which deals directly with the emissions, and something that deals with this innovation market failure, the combination is better. And so here are the two market failures that I just described, or I didn't describe this first one just now, but earlier. There's the externality with emissions, but there's also this positive externality from innovation. And the two market failures provide justification, I think, for two types of policies. One, to address each externality, emissions policies and direct technology push policies. The other thing I wanted to say by way of just broadening the view is I've talked a lot about emissions pricing and carbon taxes and cap and trade. And I think politics has generally favored other things. They say, let's not do taxes. They say, let's instead perhaps have mandated technologies instead of introducing taxes. Or let's have a performance standard. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, and there's large literature on this. One is that the cost is a little less visible. When your car has to face certain performance standards, it goes in the price of the car, but it doesn't seem as onerous, perhaps, as having to pay a tax when you register your car based on the associated externalities. And second, a lot of folks aren't confident that these newfangled emissions pricing approaches will actually work. Whereas if you introduce a standard, require a certain technology, you can enforce that, you can be sure it'll work. So that's one of the arguments. Overall, I still, not in every case, but in many cases, feel that emissions pricing has an advantage. One is that it's more flexible. By pricing, you give firms, say a steel maker, a lot of options, or electric utility, electric power plant, a lot of options. Utility, say, it can change the fuel mix, it can introduce electrostatic scrubbers, it can reorient the how much is produced by one facility versus another, or it can just cut back on output. There's all kinds of options. It can find the least cost option. Hard for the government to do that. What economics says is that costs are minimized when, at the margin, every facility is facing the same incremental cost of reduction. Governments generally don't have enough information to set standards so that every facility faces the same cost at the margin. Cap and trade and carbon taxes let the market do it. I don't want to claim that they're always going to work better, but in a lot of cases they will. So I just wanted to put emissions pricing in context. So finally, I want to go to the last two items, the lack of awareness and the disconnect possibly between public support and legislative stances. Up to now, I argued that judicial recycling of revenues could help address the unfairness issue, that free allocation of some allowances or inframarginal exemptions to a carbon tax could deal with, at least help bring special interests on board more, that generous allowance allocation and attention to co-benefits could help deal with the environmental problem, the ineffectiveness issue, I am going to have to confess that this last set of problems I find the most vexing. But I'm at least going to try to articulate what I think is underlying the problems, and maybe during the Q&A some of you will have some things to suggest. So, in terms of awareness, what does the public think? I'm going to talk here about the American public. First, we're getting conflicting signals. Nick Stern, who was knighted by the Queen of England about 5 years ago for his work on climate change, says global climate change is the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. In contrast, Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma says the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. People get mixed signals. And what do the polls show? Well, this is a poll from the Pew Research Center from 2013. Things haven't changed that much since then. On the left-hand side of this graph, you see that the view that the Earth is warming, it's been fairly constant. In fact, I think in the last year or two from my colleague at Stanford, John Krosnick, political scientist, he's done some polling, came out with an interesting poll just 2 weeks ago, shows there's been a little bit of an uptick in the last 2 years, but it's still, around 2/3 of the public. And it divides among party lines significantly, with Democrats being more likely to agree that the Earth is warming than Republicans, and independents in the middle. That's the issue of whether the Earth is warming. The issue about whether humans are causing it, again, split among party lines. Democrats tend to be more pessimistic, that is, think that humans are causing it. I don't know if pessimistic is the right word, but whereas Republicans less so. So why is there considerable doubt if, at least I'm arguing, that scientists have now pretty good evidence on this. They speak pretty much with a single voice. And I'm going to stick my neck out here because I'm an economist, I'm a political scientist. I think part of it is the problem that the networks, the media, they like to have balance. And one way they have balance is by always accompanying a scientist with a climate skeptic. That sort of suggests, we're being fair here, but that, I think, lets the public say, well, it could be this, could be that. And I think that's unfortunate. And like I said, these are real big problems that I don't find have easy solutions. I'm not sure, you don't necessarily want Big Brother to go in there and say what's balanced and what's not. So I don't have a solution to that, but I think it's a big problem. And it's even made worse by the fact that nowadays, we can all choose among literally tens of thousands of media sources for our news. And we, being human, we tend to go for sources that reconfirm what we already believe. So if you're a doubter, you tend to go to a source that confirms your doubts. And if you're very much a believer, you go to the other source. And if nothing else, that leads to a kind of stagnation where there isn't as much intercourse among the different viewpoints. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's worth recognizing. Still, I want to be a little bit more positive. Here's some results from my colleague John Krosnick from just a poll from about 2 weeks ago. It was taken in association with New York Times and ABC News. 2/3 of Americans indicate they're more likely to vote for a politician campaigning on fighting climate change. And then also, and here's the results from an earlier poll of his, not that much earlier. Excuse me, this is from that poll of 2 weeks ago. Yes, how much do you think the US government should do about global warming? A great deal, quite a bit, some, a little, or nothing. And the latest numbers are that, let's see, 52% say that government should do either a great deal or quite a bit or a lot. So that sounds great. Now, before we get too, for some of us, get too cheered by this, I will say that he also finds that 74% of Americans then ask, well, what should the government do? 74% oppose an increase in taxes on electricity. 63% oppose an increase in taxes on gasoline. So it's like, yeah, government should do something, but not in my back wallet, So it is a problem, and I don't have a solution. And so I'm going to finally get to the last issue, which is the disconnect issue. I think it is interesting that, according to Krosnick, about 2/3 of Americans think climate change is an issue that we be doing more on. Yet there is a disconnect between the stances taken on average by our federally elected legislators in Congress and the grassroots. And that's a problem too. You ask, well, why is there this disconnect? Krosnick indicates that even Oklahoma, a majority of citizens feel the U.S. should be doing more, and yet Republican senators from Oklahoma are saying no. Well, one reason may be, and I'm just speculating, but I thought, what the heck, that there is evidence that climate change is not a decisive issue. So a legislator can defy the constituents and get reelected so long as he or she is still voting correctly according to his or her constituency on other issues, like the more important issues in terms of getting elected are stances on abortion or gun control or the economy as a whole. So that may be one issue, but it doesn't completely answer it, because then there's also the question of well, why would they want to side differently? And there I think, what's the first thing that an elected official does on reaching Washington? Well, as we all know, the first thing that the elected official does is it leaves Washington and tries to raise money to get reelected. And it's probably more money in siding with the fossil fuel producers than siding with policies that would potentially cost them something, although I'm suggesting ways that it wouldn't. I guess I'm ending on a kind of somewhat negative note, but I do think there's ways that one can make inroads here and here and here. As I look at this more and more, at least at a loss in terms of how this can be, how these impediments can be overcome. Nevertheless, I think there is progress, and that my expectation is that over time we will see more and more aggressive climate change policy. The hope is that, in my view, it's aggressive enough before that we will have done enough to avert more serious climate problems down the road. Thanks.